Thank you, Senator Seward. Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Acting President. The community has been resonating with anger about this budget. There's been bust-the-budget rallies around the country, something extraordinary that 4 months after the budget came down, that anger's still been there. And at many of these rallies, the people have heard from Labor MPs standing up there condemning this government time and time again. And yesterday, the government was on the skids with this very ugly part of the budget, where the Treasurer, Mr Hockey, the Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, with the support of Liberal and National MPs, were loading the pressure, loading the hardship onto ordinary people, onto disadvantaged people. With that very bad piece of legislation really looking like it was just about over. And what does Mr Shorten, what have Labor done? The absolute deal of all deals. Talk about get out of jail, really helping this government, a government that's on the nose, that is so doing the wrong thing by the very fabric of our society, loading the problems onto families, people with disabilities, students, so many people who really have to think how they're going to make ends meet. Now, it's runs to, when you come to, I have the portfolio of higher education, and this is an area, again, where I have shared many platforms recently with Labor MPs condemning the government about what they're doing to higher education. But when you come to this piece of legislation, there are some aspects that will make life much harder for students. And what have we today seen with Mr Shorten? What have we seen with Labor? They've just voted it through in the lower house, and now they want to rush it through here. This is really extraordinary. I mean, October the 2nd, 2014 is a very ugly day now in Labor Party's history, a day when they did a deal not just with any Liberal government, but with the Abbott government, a government that within a year of taking office has done some of the most notorious, destructive, brought forward some of the most notorious, destructive policies that we've seen from a Conservative government. And again, I think it's informative to contrast what Labor is doing today with what they've said. Now, obviously, when they're speaking at bust-the-budget rallies, they're up there whipping up the crowd about how terrible the government is, and they'll stand firm and the budget must be rejected. But they've also got down to specifics. Opposition Leader Mr Bill Shorten, on the 11th of August, actually signed a public pledge which stated, "I, Bill Shorten, pledge that the ALP will block proposed changes to higher education in the Senate." Now, this is a change to higher education that we're dealing with in this piece of legislation now. Yes, there's the big bill that Minister Pyne is spruiking around the place, but there are very significant aspects in this legislation that will bring hardship to many students, and for many will make it a difference between if they can do their studies or they can't do their studies, if they can find the course that they want to at the university that they have chosen. And what we're seeing in monetary terms is that the ALP is supporting the Coalition's $400 million cuts to student welfare. And it's student welfare in the form of relocation payments and also overseas portability. Now,
order.
I do acknowledge the interjection that there just was, and that's interesting. It's from a member of the National Party, and the National Party so often want to get out there saying how they're the friends and they're the supporters of regional universities. But that the National Party senator who has just interjected, along with his colleagues, are solidly there with the government at every turn, working. Yes, and I acknowledge the interjection from my colleague as well, that this is very dishonest territory where the Nationals have entered, where they're out there trying to make out they're standing up for regional universities, students from country areas, and what they are about to vote for is a piece of legislation that will just change the benefits to a degree that will bring further hardship, and hardship that would multiply as the years roll by. And my guess is that they probably have convinced themselves, well, it's not much at the moment, but in time it will be. So just firstly to explain about the relocation costs. The relocation costs is the relocation payments has something that I've just found from my own experience in doing meetings at universities. A number of students have raised with me what a difference it's made for them. For instance, I met some students from the Blue Mountains and from western suburbs of Western Sydney who were able to get the relocation to then move closer into the city to be able to take the course that they wanted to. In one case it was vet science, another case an economic degree, and they wanted to do at Sydney University. So that now would not be possible because the definition in terms of relocation payments, how it's going to be judged, is that if your parents live in a capital city, in a major city, and major cities are defined as capital cities, Newcastle, Wollongong, Central Coast, even the Central Coast and the Gold Coast, that you no longer qualify for this assistance. And that will particularly make it hard for disadvantaged students and students from working-class families, whose families can't help them move to another capital city, to another centre, to another university, to be able to continue the studies that they have set their heart on. And again, it's a reminder, it's another insidious aspect of the policy of this government, where they are incrementally looking to change higher education in ways that it will return our university system to be more the domain of wealthy white and often men, if the other changes go through with the higher education bill that Minister Pyne is bringing forward. But right now, the relocation costs would really make it hard for young students, young men, young women who come from families who are not able to support them. Because a lot of families would obviously try and assist their young ones to be able to go ahead and study. But you shouldn't have to rely on your family for that assistance. You should be able to access the relocation payment, which we now hear that Labor is about to ditch. Now, so I had mentioned this adds up to $400 million, and the larger component of these cuts will remove access, as I just said, to relocation scholarships for students whose parents live in the major cities. And I'll say them again because, again, the national sentences in this chamber need to hear this because they're always telling us how they're the only voice for regional areas. Wollongong, Newcastle, the Central Coast. I mean, they're areas where at times they've even had MPs, and surely they should be representing their interests, as they should be across the board. For many students, this scholarship payment has made a difference in terms of their ability to move to a university and get established. I mean, if you talk to students, particularly undergraduates, but also a lot of postgraduates these days, the cost of living is really hard for them. Relocation costs add up individually for a student to about $7,000 over the years that they study. This is money they can use to assist them with their rent, transport, food, their daily living costs. You know, that money can make a real difference when you're really counting how you're going to get through the week, and can you pay the rent that week, can you buy a present for your mum, all those things that should be able to make up one's life. And again, let's just remember that we've heard time and time again from Labor MPs about how bad this budget is, about how they're standing up for students, for universities. They're the voice for public education. They've spoken at rallies, meetings, universities. As I said, what we've heard from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Shorten, he, along with other Labor MPs, have signed this pledge, very specific in terms of their commitment to block. That's the word out of their pledge, block proposed changes to higher education in the Senate. That is what we are talking about today. He can't just try and quarantine that to Mr Pyne's bill. It's not that simple. Life is not just linear in little boxes. We are dealing with legislation now that, if it passed, would add to the challenges, the hardships, the difficulties so many students face, particularly students from families where nobody's ever gone to university before. They're very proud of their son, their daughter, who has gone to university. It's often very hard for them because they haven't had that, haven't grown up in a family where people have had that opportunity. But they're giving it everything they got. But money comes into it. Money comes into it, and that needs to be considered. Now, the other aspect we have here in what Labor has done a deal with the coalition with regard to higher education is overseas portability. Now, this was just actually a very basic bit of humanity that was there, in that your payments weren't cut off from Centrelink if you went overseas for less than 6 weeks. Now, obviously, in a country like Australia, with so many people in our society with relatives, families, loved ones overseas, periodically to visit them for an emergency, they will need to go over. Okay, I again acknowledge those interjections, again from our National MP from Queensland, showing his caring attitude to students who have every right to be able to go overseas for whatever needs that they have identified. It was only for 6 weeks. Your payment was not cut off by Centrelink. Now, that was something that was just one of those reasonable things, so life can work in a more humane way, where people are able to deal with whatever comes up, whatever challenges that they might face. But that is to be removed. Again, another measure that Labor has decided that it's time to axe. So the sum total here of what Labor has done is a monumental deal. Just in higher education alone, it amounts to $400 million that they're cutting from student support. And that's on top of what, and my colleague Senator Rachel Seward, who has led for the Greens on this issue, has spoken many times on it in this place, has addressed many rallies, met with stakeholders around the country, and has identified very clearly when she has spoken today what this legislation will mean for people with disabilities, for a whole range of families, particularly single parents, as well as students. Again, what we're seeing here is that these are the people being loaded up with the costs, because this government went to in the May budget, this government with the work of Treasurer Mr Hockey, signed off obviously by the Prime Minister Tony Abbott, came up with a very ugly budget, cutting out billions of dollars. Now, the money has to come from somewhere, and it's loaded onto ordinary people by cutting their entitlements that they have every right to. This is where we need to identify what Labor is doing here. Like, how did they come up with this plan? Do the Labor senators in this chamber know anything about this, or has it just been handed to them on a plate by the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten? These are very relevant questions, because yesterday the government was on the run. Labor actually had some backbone on this very issue. The fight was on. The bust the budget people, their message was being heard here by, from what I could see, the majority of senators. And then, all of a sudden, Mr Shorten has caved. Now, we've seen him do that on the terror laws. We've seen him do it on the war in Iraq. And I heard today that he's starting to do a bit of backtracking there, talking about, yes, there could be mission creep going on. Now, the leader of the Australian Greens, Senator Christine Milne, she identified that long ago, that was one of the first things would happen, mission creep. So it's good Mr Shorten has caught up with that, so he's starting to look for a bit of wriggle room, but he did sign off with the government. And he signed off with the government on these terrible so-called anti-terrorist laws that deny people so many basic rights, have been so abused by this government. And now we have another one on higher education, on issues around. And I further acknowledge the comments from National Senator showing his caring attitude and how far that extends. Particularly now we're not even on students, we're on the whole exploitative aspects of this legislation. So this is legislation that should not be passed under any circumstances. And from what I can see, the Labor senators are not coming in on the debate. which starts to answer the question. I'm not sure if it's the correct answer, but you look for answers when you get into these debates and you see such sudden shifts in how parties conduct themselves. With yesterday this legislation being widely condemned, with detailed speeches from many of colleagues from the Labor Party about how problematic it was in so many areas, and now there's silence. I hope I'm wrong. I notice that Senator Kim Carr has just come into the chamber. I think it's very important that they do come in on this debate and explain why Labor has now decided to vote for this legislation. It was voted through in the House of Representatives quite quickly this morning. I'll be interested to look at who were the Labor MPs in the House of Representatives who signed that pledge. And again, as some senators have just come into the chamber, I think it's worth repeating because it really highlights the essence of, well, one polite word could be say contradiction, you could say betrayal from Labor with this policy. And this was the pledge that Mr Shorten has signed and a number of Labor MPs. I, Bill Shorten, pledge that the ALP will block proposed changes to higher education in the Senate. Well, we are now in the Senate. OK, maybe Mr Shorten could use the excuse we couldn't do anything about it in the House of Representatives. We can here. Labor and the Greens can vote together. We can put a good case to the crossbenchers. We can stand up for the people of Australia, stand up for Australian students who are out there with very little money, trying to do their best, do a bit of work, do their studies, get by and come forward with good marks. But now we've put some real obstacles in their path. So what is Labor's position? Are we going to hear from Labor on this most important issue? Because the last speaking list I saw from them was that that's not going to happen, and it's certainly needed, because what has happened here is extraordinary. And as I said before, the 2nd of October 2014 is going to be a very dark day in the history of Labor, because it's when the day on which a most monumental deal has been done, a deal between Labor and the Coalition to really do over so many people. Labor's giving, and again I acknowledge the interjections from the National MP. Labor has given the government a get-out-of-jail card because there's been such widespread condemnation. And again, it's worth remembering. Who can remember when a federal budget has been still discussed, still making people angry, still resulting in meetings, protests around the country more than 4 months after it was delivered? Just on Sunday, I was at a meeting. I'm happy to acknowledge that interjection too from the senator. Yes, I think you're just helping my argument. So it was just on Sunday. I was at another Bust the Budget rally. I'm happy to acknowledge the interjection. Happy to acknowledge all the interjections. And just on Sunday in Campbelltown, I was at another Bust the Budget rally. Very impressive, with a range of speakers. There was Greens members there, I understand some Labor members there. Happy to acknowledge all your interjections. And this is more than 4 months after the budget comes down, and there you have people from TAFE teachers, nurses, people from the Australian Education Union, people from the NTU, the National Tertiary Education Union, also from the Nurses Association, a range of young people talking about the call centres that they work in. It was a very informative meeting, but again, that white-hot anger is still there about the budget. I mean, I wish that Campbelltown meeting was this Sunday so I could be telling them about what Labor's done. I mean, it is just extraordinary. We really should be hearing from our colleagues on the opposition benches about what has happened here. Within 24 hours, the turnaround on something so fundamental to the very fabric of our society, let alone the economy, is quite breathtaking. Just in the higher education area alone, we're seeing $400 million ripped out if Labor go ahead and vote with the Coalition on this. It is deeply wrong what they have done. Again, I congratulate the Bust the Budget people for the huge and happy to acknowledge the National Senator for again interjecting. He's obviously been distressed, and I think just. Will he speak? Yes. That is an interesting question, because the Nationals. Let's finish. Let's finish.
Senator Sullivan. Proceed, Senator.
Thank
You've
you, and
only
I'm
got
happy to
55
acknowledge the
seconds left.
interjections and take your advice. I think it's useful to actually, we've talked a lot about Labor, to talk a little bit about the Nationals. They are experts at working both sides of the road. In this parliament, they vote solidly with the coalition party. When they're in country areas, they're telling their constituents, oh, you need us in parliament to stand up to the Liberals, to stand up to Labor. We're the only voice. We're the only voice. We're the only ones that are opposition. Absolutely untrue. Absolutely in lockstep with their Liberal colleagues time and time again. And what we have now is Nationals, Liberals and Labor. We've heard these senators say it's solidarity. Nationals, Liberals, Labor in solidarity, in lockstep, in one of the most dangerous, irresponsible pieces of legislation that rips money off so many people. Thank you, Mr Deputy President.
Thank you, Senator.